Now Joab, Zeruiah's son, could see that the king's mind was on Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there. He said to her,
"Hey, pretend to be in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes. Don't anoint yourself with oil. Act like a woman who has spent a long time mourning over someone who has died. Go to the king and speak to him as follows."
Then Joab told her what to say. When the woman from Tekoa came to the king, she fell face down, bowing low out of respect.
"King, help me."
What is wrong?
Oh, it's terrible. I'm a widow. My husband is dead. Your servant had 2 sons, but the 2 of them fought in the field. No one could separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the entire clan has turned against your servant. They say, hand over the one who killed his brother, so we can execute him for murdering his brother, even though we would destroy the heir as well. So they would snuff out the one ember I have left, leaving my husband without name or descendant on earth.
The king said to the woman,
"Return home, and I will issue an order in your behalf."
The woman of Tekoa said to the woman,
My master and king, let the guilt be on me and on my father's household. The king and his throne are innocent.
If anyone speaks against you, bring him to me, and he will never trouble you again.
Please, let the king remember your Lord, the Lord your God, so the one seeking revenge doesn't add to the destruction and doesn't kill my son.
As surely as the Lord lives, not one of your son's hairs will fall to the ground.
May your female servant say something to my master the king.
Speak.
Why have you planned the very same thing against God's people? In giving this order, the king has become guilty because the king hasn't restored his own banished son. We all have to die. We're like water spilled out on the ground that can't be gathered up again. But God doesn't take life away. Instead, he makes plans, so those banished from him don't stay that way. I have come to my master the king to talk about this because people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I must speak with the king. Maybe the king will act on the request of his servant, because the king will agree to deliver his servant from the power of anyone who would destroy both me and my son from the inheritance God gave. Your servant thought, the word of my master, the king, will definitely comfort me, because my master the king is like one of God's messengers, understanding good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you.
The king answered the woman,
I must ask you something. Don't hide anything from me.
Please, my master and king, speak.
Has Joab put you up to this?
As surely as you live, my master and king, no one can deviate a bit from whatever my master and king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who directed me, and it was Joab who told your female servant to say all these things. Your servant Joab did this to change the way things look. But my master's wisdom is like the wisdom of one of God's own messengers. He knows everything that takes place in the land.
So the king said to Joab,
All right then, I will do it. Go and bring back my boy Absalom.
Joab fell face down, bowing low out of respect, and he blessed the king.
Today your servant knows that you think well of me, my master and king, because the king has followed up on his servant's recommendation.
So Joab got up, went to Geshur, and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. The king said,
"He must go straight to his own house. He must not see my face."
So Absalom went straight to his own house and did not see the king.
Thank you, Jack, for bringing this to us this morning. It was the Spanish philosopher and writer George Santayana who actually used the saying that's misquoted a lot: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think there's a profound truth in there that's true for us as individuals, and true for us as families, true for us as a community, as a church, as a nation. And speaking as somebody who's worked as a family therapist, I can tell you that truth is surely stranger than fiction when families tell you their stories, their histories, and how painful and very destructive things in families get repeated from one generation to the next, to the next. Royal families seem to be especially prone to this problem. King David's fickle temperament and dubious morals had caused repeated tragedies in his life. And so I'm hoping you're beginning to get clear. You know, sometimes these Old Testament stories, you just hear these long names and funny names, and you sort of think, oh, this is weird. But if you can, try and hold on to who these characters are. It's really quite helpful. As I said, Absalom the son and Tamar were very close. And so Absalom was devastated by the news that his brother Amnon had raped his sister, their sister. And David too was furious, but did nothing to hold his son accountable. And 2 years later, his brother Absalom invited his brother to a sheep shearing party. Everybody got drunk, and Absalom ordered his servants to kill his brother Amnon, which they did. Absalom knew that the news of his guilt would get back to his father, the king, so he fled and took refuge at his grandfather's home in a place called Geshur. Now, Absalom had a great love and respect for his father David, and the father loved the son. But Absalom was really furious with his dad for not doing anything to hold his brother, his rapist brother, accountable for this despicable deed. David too grieved over the alienation between himself and his beloved son Absalom. He loved his son dearly and probably favored him to be the heir to the throne. Now, this is very classic in my experience of families. Everybody felt uncomfortable with this situation. This was a bad news situation. It was wrong, but nobody took the initiative to change it. Everybody was upset with everybody, and there was no moving forward. The person who took the initiative for change initially wasn't an immediate family member, but this guy Joab. Joab was a general in David's army, but also was a distant cousin of the king. And Joab enters the story and comes up with the plot that he probably can't influence David directly, but if he gets this woman to come, the wise woman from Tekoa, who is a very sensitive, tuned-in kind of person and a good actress, then maybe they could do something. So Tekoa is a village about 10 miles out of Jerusalem. And what happens is the woman comes and she presents herself as a widow in deep mourning for a loss in her own life. And she comes to the king, as often happened, looking for counsel with a family problem. We don't do this nowadays, but they used to do it back then. You go to the king, and she's asking for the king's guidance because she says one of her sons has killed another of her sons. None of this is true. It's all a ruse to get David to express an opinion. And David responds by saying that the murdering son should be forgiven and should be protected. And the woman takes a huge risk and says to the king, If you're saying this to me, why the heck aren't you saying it to yourself? Why not your son Absalom be forgiven and received back? And David sees that he's using a double standard and discovers that Joab is behind this ruse. He sends Joab to bring Absalom back from his grandfather's house, although he still insists that he doesn't want to see him. The forgiveness, you see, isn't complete. And I can't help but compare this story with the story that Jesus tells of the prodigal son in Luke's Gospel. In the story of David and Absalom, there's a father who says, yes, he can come back, but I don't want to see him. I don't want anything to do with him. Let him get his own place to live. Let him raise his own family, and I don't care if I ever see him again. Whereas in the story of the prodigal son, you remember what happens? The wayward son appears on the horizon, and dad sees him and just rushes out, and in the most touching moment throws his arms around him, sobbing, thrilled to see him home. Now David sounds more like a lot of parents I've encountered than actually the dad in the prodigal son story. David thought he was doing the right thing by withholding his love from Absalom in order to show his disapproval. Let me say for the record, that does not work. And if you pursue this story into the chapters that follow, you'll see that David's hardened heart causes a backlash that becomes very destructive, and they return to the cycle of violence. The forgiving father love of the prodigal son story isn't available to Absalom, and it makes him angry and aggressively ambitious. But let's put the spotlight back on our mystery woman, this unnamed woman of Tekoa, who risked her life in coming before her king with the intention of confronting him about his own behavior. She must have realized the pain that David's actions were causing for himself, his family, and for his nation. She knew that something had to be done to get David back on track, and she could be the one who could break the logjam of this dysfunctional family. She observed the powerlessness of David's family members and the court officials. She must have been a knowledgeable and discerning person with great tact and diplomacy skills. She was a woman of extraordinary courage, and she saw in this situation she had the power, if she would choose to take it, to bring healing change, and she took a great risk in doing so. This woman, you see, provides us with a narrative of hope in the midst of a desperate situation. She reminds us that a cycle of violence and abuse can be broken. Instead of paralysis, there can be movement towards healing and a different future. Sure, Joab is the one who takes the initiative and sees that the future as is not good. Something needs to change. Why wasn't it possible for Absalom to come home, confess his wrongdoing, receive some kind of punishment for his crime? Then everybody could move on instead of being stuck in present painful realities. A wise woman comes onto the scene and lifts up the possibility of forgiveness and compassion instead of vengeance. The old requirements of the law can be upheld in spirit and can be used to initiate a new future. There's a really powerful spiritual truth here for each of us. So many of us get stuck in our own individual histories and the histories of our families that we resist entertaining the possibilities of new futures for ourselves. Family histories often keep a stranglehold on people's lives, preventing a true freedom to find a personal destiny. The fiction created by the wise woman of Tekoa reminds us that it is our role with ourselves and the church's role in the world to be the one who generates the narrative of hope, telling a story of forgiveness and new possibility. Imagine down the centuries how much the prodigal son story has brought forgiveness and healing to troubled individuals and families. We are in the business of storytelling. We can create narratives that help each other and other people to see themselves and their possibilities in new ways. In our own personal study and in our devotion, as well as in the preaching and teaching of the church, we can figure out what it means to have these ancient stories give new hope to our lives and to our world. This woman's story was one in which she refused to let the law have the last word about her son. The community of faith should constantly tell stories that affirm the ultimate worth of all people, and regardless of circumstances, make them included rather than outcasts or separate from each other. We are called to call people back into relationship with each other and with God. The tragedy of this story is that in spite of the woman's call and David's positive response, David still didn't go far enough in enabling restoration. He stopped short. He made a gesture of reconciliation in allowing Absalom to return, but fell short of full acceptance that would have brought real healing. It seems as though at one moment David saw the possibility of a new future with his son, but then didn't have the courage to walk through the door of that new future and embrace his son in love. It's 2 stress-filled years before he sees Absalom, and then, by then, it's too late. I don't know how much you see yourself and your family in this story. I don't know how much in your situation, the ways in which fear and anger dominate. As with a family last week, not a church family, where family members haven't spoken to each other for years. And then somebody dies and everybody feels guilty. And then the guilt turns into anger. And then the grief becomes the source of more rage and more separation and more self-destructive behavior. I invite you today to review your own role and see how you can be challenged by the wise woman of Tekoa to tell a different story. I want to mention too that there are national implications to this. Since 9/11, we have responded in very strange ways to those events. I'm saddened and embarrassed by it. We've set up a whole Department of Homeland Security with a massive budget, and we have these huge budgets for defense. And yet, we play games with a debate about gun violence. How many people would have died in terrorist attacks without Homeland Security? But we know that since the Newtown atrocity last December, 20,000 people have died as a result of gun violence. And we're still playing political games with the gun violence questions. We see the foolishness and the immorality, but we say, oh dear, I can't see any way to change it. The issues raised this week in the sentencing of Bradley Manning and the whole Edward Snowden thing, they're all very complicated. But I do find the responses to these 2 men more troubling than the things they did in the first place. We do have a problem with truth-telling, and we have created through the Patriot Act some of the basic structures of the police state. These 2 troubled young men have shone a spotlight into a corner where some light was needed. And yes, they broke the law, and they knew they would be punished. But reporters do need to know that they can investigate and tell us what our government is doing. And if our government is spying on us, we need to know about that. Freedom of speech means also that reporters need to be able to speak to America's enemies without fear of imprisonment. At the moment, they cannot do that. In this whole area, we need as much transparency about absolutely everything that we can have without compromising national security. That is not happening at the moment. If I were a reporter in the whole international affairs arena at the moment, I would be very scared. The Bradley Manning decision would give me real pause for thought. We heard this week that 2 House members, Republican Representative Morgan Griffith of Virginia and Democratic Representative Alan Grayson of Florida, have been unsuccessful in securing information about the ways in which secret investigations are carried out and the mechanisms covering the FISA court. You know what the FISA court is, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. We all understand that there's a need for secrecy and intelligence gathering, but there has to be some accountability. Somebody needs to be telling this story. You see, that the fear of terrorism has brought us closer to a totalitarian police state than most people recognize. We need to be telling truth to power, just as the woman of Tekoa did. We need to be ready to ask hard questions and speak truth to power, whether we're talking about the NSA, the executive branch of government, or Uncle George in our family, who has always told us that we should have nothing to do with Cousin Mabel. You see, even the very proud King David was willing to listen to the painful truth, even though he didn't know quite in the end what to do with it. The wise woman of Tekoa gave him a doorway through which he could walk to new health and new truth. So, where do you find yourself in this story? It's really important that we all learn how to speak up words of health, and that we avoid knee-jerk reactions. Are you an Absalom? Are you somebody who really did make a big mistake, either real or perceived, for which forgiveness hasn't been available? Are you a David, somebody who toys with offering forgiveness, but really finds it difficult to offer 100%? Are you a Joab, trying to make peace and reconfigure the family? Or are you maybe a wise woman of Tekoa, the one who takes the initiative to bring healing? Or maybe there are parts of all of these characters in you. Sometimes you're one, sometimes you're another. So I want to end with a plea, and that is that we as a congregation see ourselves as wise women of Tekoa, reaching out, taking initiatives, making a point of telling healing stories so that we can be a healing presence in the midst of conflict. So that we can turn George Santayana's quote upside down, and instead of saying those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, we can say with confidence that those who learn from the past can be liberated from it and experience true joy and hope in living. So there we are. We offer hope and grace in the name of the Father of unconditional love of the prodigal Son, in the name of Jesus Christ, the one who lived and died and rose again, so that we may live in love and hope all our days. Amen. We're going to stand and sing.